everyone, and welcome to SUNUP. I'm Lyndall Stout. With the warmer temperatures, pastures are starting to green up. Joining us now is Dr. Alex Rocateli, our extension forage specialist. Alex, it's kind of a pivotal time for Bermuda grass. Give us some advice.
Yes, now is the time the Bermuda grass start to green up. Soil temperatures are reaching around 65 during the day and 60 during the night, so the Bermuda grass start to wake up. And that's a time that we need to be thinking very strategically on how to proceed with our pastures.
Okay, so what are some of the initial steps that producers need to do? They kind of need to identify the Bermuda grass. That's step one, right?
Right. At this time, in the past, before Bermuda grass green up, the producers could just apply a non-selective herbicide and kill all the weeds that were coming up. But now becomes a very critical time, because if the Bermuda grass in some places are red, greening up, and in some places on the verge to green up, the producers must be scouting and making sure that the Bermuda grass didn't green up yet, so they can still apply some glyphosate to control. As you can see here, it's pretty green, but if you go down and see, there is no much Bermuda grass in this specific pasture. Now, if you cross and you look at there's much more. So what I'm saying is it's very important to identify the Bermuda grass.
So what do people need to look for specifically?
Well, when we're looking for Bermuda grass, if you want to really know if we have a red Bermuda grass greening up on your pasture, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you identify where the dead growth from last season was, and you start to look around, and you can see that from the below ground of the plant, you can see that the new plants start to come, as you can see here, right? And as you can see, Bermuda grass, it's kind of connected by stolons and rhizomes. The rhizomes are structures that's very difficult to see here, but are structures underground. As you can see, like, we don't have just one specific stem coming out. You can see that they are together.
Right.
And so that's why this plant, I say, has stolons here. That's another way to identify. And one thing is, the Bermuda grass has pretty much, like, the stem of the Bermuda grass is pretty much flattened. So it's not rounded. You can feel when you place your fingers that it's not rounded, it's a flat stem. And if that's not enough, you can just look and see that when you look at the leaf here, in this part of the leaf there is no hairs at all. And when you go to the leaf blade, also we don't have hairs. But when you look where the leaf sheet and the leaf blade meets, can you see we have long puff of hairs at the corners here. So that's how you can identify Bermuda grass.
So bottom line, it's at a critical stage of development, and the herbicides could affect that if you apply them now, if it's already sprouted.
Exactly. What happened is the Bermuda grass on these kind of underground structures in the internodes, I mean, that's where the Bermuda grass last year accumulate all the reserves so it can survive during the winter. So during the winter, the Bermuda grass was just spending all that energy. And what happened now is the plant is pretty much, I would say, starving. And the energy that is still there, the plant is saying, well, let me invest with the soil temperature going up on new leaves so I can make more energy. So imagine if you apply a non-selective herbicide or even a selective herbicide that has restriction for green up, what can happen is you would damage, injure too much your green leaf that's going to do new photosynthesis and energy, and at the same time you don't have more energy here to grow new leaves. So that's where it can be very bad for your pasture, and if you keep doing that year after year, your pasture with time is going to thin out.
Sure. Now, once it's established and kind of the pasture has filled out, so to speak, then you can apply herbicide later?
Yes, green up is a stage that I would say when you see new growth coming up is when the green up, I would say, start. And I would say the green up ends when you can see that the Bermuda grass is quite even in your field and you have about 2 inches of growth.
Well, we're just touching on the subject today, but you have some fact sheets that our viewers can check out?
Yes, we have some fact sheets on Bermuda grass establishment for springing, for seed, and also some fact sheets on Bermuda grass management overall. And also, don't forget that we have our county educators. They are always a good resource to check if you have more specific questions.
Great. Well, great information, Alex, and we'll see you again soon. And for a link to those fact sheets, as well as a link to find your local county extension office, go to sunup.okstate.edu.
Welcome to the Mesonet Weather Report. I'm Wes Lee. We are quickly approaching what should be the wettest time of the year for Oklahoma. Usually late April through June marks the wettest months of the year when looking at the state as a whole. This past week, we received some great rainfall, but only in parts of the state. This 7-day map from midweek shows 1-inch plus numbers in most of the southeast. Seminole came in with a whopping 4.08 inches, and McCurtain County had numbers above 3 inches. But as been the case for many months, most of the drought-stricken Northwest missed out on the big rains and recorded numbers of 1/10 or less. Zeros again for the driest parts of the Panhandle. Here is our deepest look of soil moisture levels on Wednesday. It is the percent plant available water from the surface down to 32 inches under sod. You can see that the eastern 2/3 are in great shape, but the reds and yellows in the west show areas where the drought is most persistent. It would be nice if weather patterns change in the west before they miss out on the normally wettest months of the year. Rainfall that is desperately needed to replenish soil moisture levels there before the heat of summer returns. Now here's Gary showing the recent rain's impact on the drought map.
Thanks, Wes, and good morning, everyone. Well, as Wes said, our drought map does look a little bit better. Let's get straight to that map and see where we're at. Well, better is a relative term, of course. We do have at least the eastern half of the state looking a lot better than it has, with mostly abnormally dry conditions and maybe moderate drought. A little bit of severe to extreme drought peppered in there, and even a lot of the far eastern parts of the state completely out of drought. But we still have that monster area of extreme to exceptional drought covering the western half of the state. In general, a few areas of just plain severe drought, which sounds a lot better than it is. But we do still have that bad area across the western half of the state, and unfortunately still getting lots of impacts, especially wildfires across that part. That improvement's really come on some beneficial spring rains. Of course, climatological spring started March 1st. We look at the rainfall since that time frame. We do see that eastern part of the state with a good general 4 to 6 inches of rainfall, a little bit less, a little bit more in some areas. And then across the western half of the state, generally less than 2 inches of rain. Again, a little bit more, a little bit less in places. But that's the overall picture of the rainfall since spring began. The haves versus have-nots for spring so far does show up pretty well on the percent of normal rainfall map for that same time frame. All the greens and darker greens show those areas of surpluses. The reds and darker reds, oranges, yellows, those are areas of deficits. And unfortunately, those deficits are still pretty strong across the western half of the state over into other portions of south central and east central Oklahoma. As Wes told you, the soil moisture doing a little bit better. Could be better, of course, especially across the western portions of the state. And compared to last year, if you look at this map from the USDA, we do see 59% of the state's topsoil moisture percent short to very short. That's 36% more than last year at this time. So at least compared to last year, the drought is much more severe. So we're going to continue to see those drought impacts, especially across the western half of the state, and especially those impacts due to fire danger. So that's it for this time. We'll see you next time on the Mesonet Weather Report.
talking grain markets right now with our crop marketing specialist, Dr. Kim Anderson. So Kim, let's jump right in. What's going on?
Well, you can look at the factors that's impacting prices right now. Probably the biggest is Ukraine and Russia and the war that's going on over there. Then there's weather. You go in central to western U.S., too dry. You go back to the east, it's too wet, delayed planting. You got the USDA reports that came out last week that's being digested. Price volatility, and of course, your higher input cost.
You know, for the past few weeks, weekly, you've been given updates, just what's happening in the world with the crop market. Let's go back to January and talk about how those factors have changed.
Well, if you look at wheat right now, you can forward contract wheat in north central Oklahoma, the Panhandle, for $10.10, just above $10. Southern Oklahoma around $9.70. You go back to January 1, we were at $7.50 for harvested 2022 wheat. It came on out pretty much flat. And when we got into late February, when the conflict started in Ukraine and Russia, $8, it moved up to $11.50 for a forward contract, and then it came back down. It wallered between 9 and 10, 10 and a quarter, something like that. And of course, right now we're right above $10 for forward contracts. And so what you've got is those factors and the strong demand for wheat prices, and it's increased the risk. Now that's shown with the basis. You go back before the conflict started, that basis was a minus 28 cents. After the conflict, it went down to a minus 87 cents. It's down now to about a minus 58. That difference in 28 and 58 is how much risk the merchandisers are putting on this market price.
So what about corn and sorghum?
Well, you look at corn, you can forward contract north central Oklahoma $6.80 right now, Panhandle around $7.45, southern Oklahoma $7.10. But you go back to January 1, you were at $5.20. But corn has just made a slow and kind of a little faster increases in prices for the last 2 months. A lot of that was relatively tight stocks, relatively good demand, and then late February, the war. 18% of exported corn's coming out of Ukraine, so naturally we had another increase in price. Also, as you look at this graph, look at the volatility, the increased variability in prices after we got past February the 20th. $6.80 for corn right now, that's relatively good. Of course, part of that is you look at corn planted acres, 89.5 million, 93.4 last year. And that's the high input costs coming in there impacted that. Lot happening in that market.
So we can't forget about soybeans. So how's soybean kind of reacting along with corn and sorghum?
Well, soybeans, you don't have to put as much nitrogen fertilizer, if any, on the beans. So you had increased planted acres for soybeans. 91 million this year compared to 87.2 last year. You go back to January, soybean prices were $11 or so. When the war started, they had increased to 14. That's because we had a smaller Brazilian crop than we'd anticipated, and we got that run up in prices. Since late February, the soybean prices really moved sideways to slightly lower. Right now, we're at $13.80, within 20 cents of where we were in late February.
So what about cotton? The last time we spoke, cotton really hadn't done much, so what's going on with cotton?
Well, cotton, we had a high price because of the increased demand in relatively tight stocks. Demand for cotton has depleted the cotton supply. Planted acres for cotton this year are up 9% at 12.2 million acres. Go back to January, 94-cent cotton. This is the forward contract or the hedge price for coming out for the fall 22 cotton crop. By the time you got into early February, you was at 100. It wallered around to 100, 105. Oh, the last couple of weeks, it's went up to about $113. This is demand-driven cotton prices and reduced stocks.
All righty, thanks, Kim. Dr. Kim Anderson, grain marketing specialist here at Oklahoma State University.
We're joined now by Dr. Rod Hall, our state veterinarian for the state of Oklahoma, who is based out of the Department of Agriculture. Dr. Hall, thanks for joining us today. We want to dive right in and talk about avian influenza. And in the last week or so, we've had a case confirmed in Oklahoma. So get us up to speed on what happened and where we are now.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, Lyndall. We did have almost 2 weeks ago now, we had a person in Payne County who found a wild waterfowl that wasn't sure if it was injured or sick. Collected it, took it to the veterinary school at Oklahoma State University, and the prognosis was very, very poor. So they went ahead and humanely euthanized that duck, and then took it to the Oklahoma Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab to be necropsied and tested, and it was positive at that lab. It had to be since avian influenza is a foreign animal disease, it has to be confirmed at a USDA lab. So a few days later, we got confirmation that it was positive for highly pathogenic avian influenza, and this only confirmed what we already knew, that the virus was present in Oklahoma.
And we've talked with our extension veterinarians, Dr. Whitworth and Dr. Biggs, about some of those biosecurity measures. It doesn't hurt to go ahead and give a quick overview again of some of those safety practices. What do folks with poultry need to do?
Well, I'm going to focus mainly on the backyard poultry, Lyndall, because our commercial poultry industry, they have to take biosecurity measures already for other diseases. But for the backyard folks that have 6 or 8 or 10, or in some cases even much larger backyard flocks, they can take some measures to help prevent exposure of their birds. Since the virus is carried by these wild waterfowl, we're looking at places where wild waterfowl come to visit. So that would be farm ponds, lakes, city lakes, rivers, and then the potential for the domestic poultry to come to those places. So anytime we want to try to prevent those domestic poultry from going to ponds, or to prevent the wild waterfowl from coming up into areas where domestic poultry are gathered, just covering the areas where domestic poultry are to prevent the droppings from these wild waterfowl as they're flying over.
And it's my understanding that this is pretty contagious. Can you give us some context on that, on how the disease is transmitted from one animal to another?
It is very contagious. Once it gets into domestic poultry, so usually we think of chickens and turkeys. It goes from one to the other very easily. It doesn't take much of whatever kind of material. Like I say, typically it's the feces of those infected animals.
So what can the public do to help with this situation in terms of reporting and just helping with the tracking? What do you need people to do?
Well, certainly if producers have sick birds, and we're talking the domestic poultry here, so chickens or turkeys, any significant illness or deaths in those birds, we would appreciate the people contacting us and letting us know. We've got 2 numbers that we'd like to give out. So our number here at the Oklahoma Department of Ag is area code 405-522-6141. So that number would be the one to call for any suspicious cases in domestic poultry. If a person notices wild waterfowl, they can report that to the USDA Wildlife Services.
Dr. Hall, thank you for your time today and an update on this kind of evolving situation. For a link to the phone numbers that Dr. Hall mentioned, and for more information on avian influenza and its prevention, go to our website, sunup.okstate.edu.
Good morning, Oklahoma. Welcome to Cow-Calf Corner, and thanks for joining us. This week, we continue on our topic of management considerations on our replacement heifers, It's that time of year we're thinking about which ones we're going to keep back to make the next set of cows. And last week we talked about some feeding strategies, some selection strategies. This week we want to talk about reproductive tract scoring. Sometimes it's difficult to look at those heifers and know for sure whether or not they've reached puberty. And in some cases, even if they're at their target weight, we can't always say with 100% certainty that they're cycling and they've reached puberty. Reproductive tract scoring is something we're going to do in consultation with our veterinarian. He's going to actually come out and do a rectal palpation on those heifers, going to reach in, palpate ovaries, and those heifers are going to get a score from 1 to 5, where 1 tells us that their ovaries are immature, we're not picking up any activity, that we've got oocytes or that there's a corpus luteum, and the other extreme of that scale is that those heifers get a score of 5, which means we're actually picking up a corpus luteum, they've had a heat, they've ovulated, and so now we've got a CL on them. And the intermediate scores, when we get into scores around 2 or 3, we're going to have to make some management decisions on those. Those 2s, we probably separate out with the 1s and figure they're not ready. We're going to go ahead and cull them. The 3s we're kind of iffy on. The 4s and 5s are the ones we feel pretty good are ready to breed up, turn out bulls with, and they are ready. So in tandem with what we talked about last week, at this time of year, as we think about trying to overcome some of the lack of cool season grass and some of the lack of moisture we've dealt with, another thing to take a look at in making decisions on which yearling heifers to keep is using reproductive tract scoring to our advantage to know which ones are actually ready for breed up. Thanks again for joining us this week.
And just a quick reminder about the upcoming Eastern Oklahoma Beef Cattle Summit. The event will be at the Southeast Expo Center in McAllister on Thursday, April 14th. The cost is $20, and for more information about this event, go to sunup.okstate.edu.
Talking pests in wheat fields now, and the particular mite that thrives in dry weather and can also cause issues in your field. Here's SUNUP's Curtis Hare and our extension entomologist, Dr. Tom Royer.
Usually if you spot some changes in the color of your wheat, that might signal a wheat disease, but Tom, there's an insect problem that could be causing that.
Right, because it's been so dry this year, I've gotten calls about a mite, actually not an insect, but a mite called brown wheat mite, and they show up when it gets dry like this, and they can cause issues with the wheat. They feed on individual cells of the leaf, and so they make the leaf just kind of look sick and discolored, maybe take on a grayish or brownish, tannish cast, and it just looks like the wheat's just not doing what it should be doing at that time of the year. But when it's so dry, sometimes people mistake it for, well, it's a drought stress or it's some kind of disease, but if they go out in the field and check, they might see that they have a brown wheat mite problem. So
first, let's just jump right in. How can you check to see if you have a brown wheat mite problem?
What I usually suggest is to get a piece of white paper, and on a windy day like this, you want to keep it so it's not blowing around, but you can just go out in your field and set it down like this and just tap. And if they're, before they blow away, if you start seeing a bunch of them crawling around on the, that tells you have a problem. Now the bad news is, if you have a lot of them, we don't have a threshold, so it's just, if you got a lot of them and the wheat's looking sick, that's when we suggest you treat.
Okay, so let's start off, how do we treat?
Well, there's some good news and bad news about brown wheat mite. The good news is it doesn't show up every year. The bad news is we've actually looked at evaluating some products up in Goltry and down in Walters this year, and the initial results are that nothing works great. We've lost one of our probably most effective tools, chlorpyrifos. It's no longer no longer be able to use it in any of our food crops. So what we've got left that actually has brown wheat mite on the label is dimethoate. And then we have a lot of pyrethroids that don't list mites on the label, but they're registered for use in wheat, so we wanted to see how they held up against dimethoate. And it turns out they don't hold up quite as well, and it's not like dimethoate is the greatest product in the world to use for them too. So Right now we're looking, at least the tests that I have, maybe 50 to 60% control. That's about it.
So, you know, since it's kind of, they're really hard to control, how much, like what type of damage will this make to the overall yield of the crop?
It can cause some yield loss, but if we get any kind of rains, that'll probably get rid of them a lot of times, because they do not like wet conditions of any kind. They don't do very well. There's I think diseases that take them out, do that kind of thing. So a lot of times we've just kind of ignored them because they don't show up every year and we don't really have a strong threshold. But if there's a problem with them right now, yeah, you need to do something about it.
So before we let you go, you know, spring's here, the wheat's starting to green up. There has been rain in some spots.
Yes.
So in regards to other insects that we normally worry about this time of year, are you seeing or hearing anything?
Right now I'm not hearing much. I kind of like hearing that it's kind of quiet on the wheat front right now, but you never know. Anything can show up. Aphids could show up. Armyworms could show up later. So it's always important to watch your wheat. And it's especially important this year because the price of wheat is really high. And so if anybody has a healthy wheat crop, they're going to want to protect it from pests, including diseases and insects and that kind of thing.
All right, thanks, Tom. Tom Royer, Extension Entomologist here at Oklahoma State University. And if you'd like some information for what he talked about, go to our website, sunup.okstate.edu.
That'll do it for us this week. Remember, you can see us anytime on our website, sunup.okstate.edu, and also follow us on YouTube and social media. I'm Lyndall Stout. Have a great week, everyone, and remember, Oklahoma agriculture starts at sunup.